Hello, WoTL participants. Cherise and Darren here. This is a first in what will be 2 webinars as follow-ups to the workshops that we ran both on Eyre Peninsula in July and Tailem Bend in early September, I think it was. And we've been working with Kim since then to look at what topics would be really useful to support that original theme of building resilient women. And the 2 topics that we came up with, one was emotional intelligence, which we're going to look at today, and the second one was exploring your why, which is really focused on values and connecting values to the way that we spend our time and live our lives, etc. So in terms of the way we're going to run this is kind of a bit like a question and answer thing. So Cherise is going to kick off by asking me a series of questions, which I'll respond to in terms of my experience of working particularly with leaders around emotional intelligence. And then I'll ask Cherise some questions that relate more to the practice of mindfulness and how that can link to building emotional intelligence. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Cherise, who's going to ask me a question.
Okay, well, hello everyone, first of all, and it's great to connect with you again. And Darren and I have been keeping our eye on the weather ever since we've been over to the Eyre Peninsula and also over to Tailem Bend, just really so much more aware through our connection with all of you of how important that rain is this season. So we hope you've had very generous rainfalls. So Darren, emotional intelligence. I know you've done a lot of work with this in the corporate world. So I just thought it'd be great if you could tell me about what emotional intelligence is all about.
Yes, I think all of us when we were at school probably remember having to do all sorts of tests, and the majority of those were really to determine what our IQ was. And I guess IQ is something that people are probably familiar with, and it was about our capacity for developing cognitive reasoning and what we like at maths and spatial awareness and various other things. And a number of years ago now, a lot of work began to be done in this area of emotional intelligence. So rather than IQ as being a fixed thing that we can't really change, one of the great things about emotional intelligence is that all the research indicates that it's something we can continue to grow and develop over our lifetimes. So you're not just set with what you've got, you can continue to chip away at it. And that it really, I think in essence, it's really about how we do 2 things, about how we manage ourselves, and it's about how we manage and build relationships. And they are really the 2 core components of emotional intelligence.
Right. Okay. Great. And what are some of the misconceptions people might have about emotional intelligence? Can you dispel some of those misconceptions?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have heard of the term emotional intelligence, but when I ask a group of people, what do you know about emotional intelligence and what do you think it's about? Most people will say, I think it's about being empathic. And yes, empathy is a component of emotional intelligence, but it's only one of the components, and it's not emotional intelligence in itself. And so I think one misconception is that it's just about being empathic. I think the other one is that it's considered to be a soft skill. And as a result of it being a soft skill, it's something that's more likely to naturally reside with women than with men.
So women are more emotionally intelligent?
Well, I think, once again, the preconception can be that, well, women will naturally be better at emotional intelligence because it's more aligned to a female disposition. And once again, the research has indicated that while women are likely to be naturally stronger in some areas of emotional intelligence, they are not necessarily stronger in all of them. And we as humans can develop both our female and male elements of emotional intelligence regardless of which gender we are. So it's not okay as a male to say, well, I'm not going to be good at emotional intelligence because I'm a male.
Right.
And it's also not appropriate to suggest that you'll be better at it because you're a woman.
Right.
But our areas for growth or development might be different. And I think probably the typical one would be there's an element of emotional intelligence which looks at it, drive or motivation or drive for results and being self-driven and getting things done. Now that is, I guess, often a characteristic, that drive and achievement focus that is naturally attributed to a lot of men. So the research that Daniel Goleman did, Daniel Goleman's book, Working with Emotional Intelligence, he actually found that of the emotional intelligence components, men overall had a stronger drive around motivation, were more driven to achieve things.
Yes. Yeah.
But women in general did score more highly around the traits like empathy. So I think overall, we've all got areas for growth and development, and they might not necessarily align with our gender.
Okay.
So I think that's probably the other one to dispel. And I think the other one is possibly that it's easy to believe that if we build, I think another assumption is that if we build our emotional intelligence, we'll be nicer and we'll be more accommodating perhaps and easy to get on with, and maybe even we'll say yes more. There's not a connection there either. So probably the other one is...
It's not just about being agreeable.
It's not about being nice and agreeable.
Yeah. Okay.
No, that's not what emotional intelligence is about either. So I think they're probably the three, ones that it's actually really good to say it's not about these things.
Right. Okay. So what is it about that?
If it's not about...
What are the components of it?
Yeah.
How would you identify the components of emotional intelligence?
I might ask you at this point maybe if you can share your screen. I put together a bit of an outline taken from Daniel Goleman's work on what some of those key characteristics are, and I'll just let you get that up on the screen. And basically, Goleman, as you can see here, Goleman really divides emotional intelligence into 5 key areas. So you'll see on the left-hand side there, they're listed as 5 different competencies. So the first one being self-awareness, the next one being self-regulation, the next one motivation, the next one empathy, and the next one social skills. And they're actually divided up. There's a connection between them. So Goleman would say that we need to have self-awareness so that we can build self-regulation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And we need to build self-regulation so that we stay focused on the things that we're wanting to achieve, which then links to motivation.
Yeah.
And so those first 3, self-awareness, self-regulation, and motivation, that they are the key elements of emotional intelligence that relate to work that we do on ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
Then the final 2, the empathy and social skills, is about how we actually go about relating and building relationships and rapport with others. So first 3 are work for us to do on us. Next 2 are about us building relationships and rapport with others. And as we go through, I think what you'll see is it's highly likely for all of us that we'll look at these different competencies and recognize that there's some areas that if we filtered it through a self-assessment, as long as we had a high level of self-awareness, we could probably give ourselves a pretty high score in some areas. I think it's probably a strength and something I do reasonably well.
Yeah.
But for all of us as well, there's likely to be some other areas where at times maybe we wouldn't score as highly, and they're possibly the areas for development. So maybe we'll just have a talk through each of those, and I can maybe give some examples. So self-awareness. So Goleman says under self-awareness, this is about having an accurate self-assessment so that we don't have what we would call blind spots. And I guess blind spots are things that we do or ways that we are that we have no visibility into either what we are doing or the impact that it's having on others.
Can you give an example of something?
I regularly, when I'm working with leaders, will have an opportunity to complete for them things like a 360-degree assessment.
Right.
And a 360-degree assessment is an opportunity for them to answer a series of questions about how they see themselves in terms of strengths, areas for development, how effective they are at communicating, etc. And then that same series of questions will be asked by others who know them well. Direct reports, colleagues, they can even go outside their organisation and get feedback from customers or suppliers, for example. And the reason it's called a 360 is ideally it actually gets feedback from a broad range of stakeholders who will have different ways of, different relationships to us, but will add to the richness of that picture.
Yeah.
People with high levels of self-awareness, when that data comes back, there's normally a really strong correlation between the scores across all of those stakeholder groups. So the way those leaders with high levels of self-awareness see themselves is very similar to how they are perceived by others.
Right.
It doesn't mean they're going to be good at everything, but they've got high awareness of the areas that they're likely to perform well in and the areas that perhaps don't perform as well in. So a classic example would be a leader who says, I've had feedback in the past. I know that at times when I'm under pressure, I don't have a lot of patience or tolerance for people, and it probably comes across to them as though I'm not very approachable. Now, that would be somebody being aware of the fact that that's how they come across to others and the impact that that might have.
Yeah.
A leader with low self-awareness would probably mark themselves as being high in approachability, and yet the data that comes back from other people involved in the survey, the scores would be significantly different because they are unaware that either they behave that way or that people notice it, or that it actually has an impact on people's willingness to approach them.
Yeah.
So self-awareness is key, and in all the leadership development programs I run, we often talk about leadership development as being a process of self-development, and self-development is really about understanding ourselves. And I think the most effective people, whether they are leaders or not, are people who know themselves well, have minimised their blind spots, and we can probably talk a bit more about how we can perhaps go about overcoming some of the areas that we might identify that we've got weaknesses in. One of them being, I guess, the willingness to ask for feedback.
Right. Yeah.
Take it on board, acknowledge it, and keep chipping away at working on it, particularly around the self-awareness. But in terms of effectiveness, self-awareness is not enough. And the difference between self-awareness and the second one that Goleman has there, which is self-regulation. I'll go back to the previous example. I might be aware that under pressure, I come across as stressed and have low tolerance with people and are not easy to approach. I might be aware of that. And yet, if I continue to perpetuate that behaviour when I'm under pressure or stress, I haven't actually learned to self-regulate.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of people will say self-awareness is the easy part, self-regulation is the hard part.
Is that the same thing as self-control, like controlling yourself?
Partly. Goleman says there's a difference. His wording, in fact, I'll just have a look at it. Goleman says, one of his statements is that out of control emotions make smart people stupid. Right.
That's a big statement.
It's a big statement.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is that if we don't get enough of a handle on our potential derailers, so derailers are those behaviours that when we're under a lot of pressure or stress might occasionally come out, and they're the ones that make people question whether or not it's actually safe around us. And so self-regulation is not suppressing emotion and coming across as being sort of bland or unemotive. And he says there's a difference between emotions being out of control and actually managing our impulses in a way, but we still let people know how our emotional states are. So it's okay to be upset or disappointed or frustrated or even angry, but we can't let that overwhelm us to the point where we are out of control when we're expressing those emotions. So, and there's a fine line.
Yeah, that seems like that would be a really worthwhile thing to keep developing on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, it's probably one of the more challenging. It's easy to have high levels of self-regulation when we're not under pressure, but when it matters most is when we are. And when we're under pressure, it's those one or two times that we might snap or say something sarcastic or dismissive or that's a put down or something similar that people will remember and they'll hold on to.
Yeah.
And therefore, they have the potential to become our derailers. So buying some time, I think we talked on the workshop, buying some time to press the pause button.
Yeah.
We talked about the difference in the workshop between reacting and responding, and people who develop this emotional intelligence component around self-regulation are very good at pressing pause and then responding, not reacting.
Yeah.
Being mindful of the impact, the negative impact that them reacting may have on relationships. The third one that relates to us is the one of motivation. So Goleman says they're a passion to work for reasons that go beyond money and status, and that will probably actually be a really good thing to pick up on too in the second of these webinars.
With values.
Talking about values.
Yeah.
Goleman said that people who are really strong from an emotional intelligence point of view around motivation, he said, will be internally, will have an internal achievement drive. So it's not based on somebody else asking us to do things that gets us to initiate things, to be proactive, which probably came up when we talked about Stephen Covey's work as well. He talks about us also being optimistic, goes along with motivation. And the last one he talks about in terms of a subcategory of that is persistence. So motivation is also about being persistent in the spite of setbacks as well. So
not giving up.
Not giving up easily and bouncing back from setbacks or rejection, or it didn't go right the first time, I need to give it another shot. All of those things would fit into that category of motivation.
Yeah.
So that's really the first three that are within us, and that's about us developing those competencies. And because he lists them as competencies, meaning that they are things that we can develop.
Yeah.
And I think that's the great bit of news about emotional intelligence is even if you look at some of these and think, gee, that's definitely not a strength of mine, you can kind of really say it's not a strength of mine yet. And if I convince myself that it would be worth putting the effort in, the effort that we put in will pay off because we can get better at all of these.
This reminds me a little bit of that quadrant in the time management chart that you showed during the seminar that we were present at. The corner that is important but not urgent. Like this seems to me that this fits into that quadrant a little bit, that it takes a kind of determination that this will be valuable enough that I'll spend time doing that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, we all know that behaviour change is hard. And what we're talking about here, these are competencies that we develop through the ways that we behave. So consistently behaving in a different way will lead to building the competency. And to give myself a good enough reason to be worth putting the effort into changing behaviour, for all of us, for our behaviour to change, three things need to happen. One, we need to become aware of what we're currently doing. Two, we need to buy into the fact that it will be worthwhile doing something different. In other words, accepting that continuing to do things the way that I have is going to get a less than optimal outcome, and therefore it's good enough reason to change. And thirdly, we need to understand what the change looks like. So if I've previously done this, what is it that I would need to do instead or differently that would actually get a better outcome? And that's where the emotional intelligence really comes in. Because it's not until, if we go back to those early examples, if my previous behaviour under pressure is when someone asks me to do something, that I snap at them and say, can't you see how busy I am? I haven't got time for that. And that's my habit. I don't want to change that. I'm going to have to put some concerted work into going, first of all, I need to work out what a pause button would be. How do I press pause so that I actually respond, not react?
Yeah.
So that what I say is different.
Mm.
Therefore, the way the person perceives me as being is different. And therefore, I can maintain the approachability and the relationship that's actually a really important one that I've built up over time, rather than have that person think, I'm never going to go and ask them anything again that looks like they're under pressure because that was the experience that I had.
Yeah. Mm. We remember those. We remember the bad experiences with people often more than the good experiences with people.
It's true.
I've found with bosses in the past, and yeah.
Well, unfortunately, those occasional poor experiences or interactions, they also become part of our reputation. And others will say, look, just watch out, because every now and then. And even though that person may have never experienced that, I'm now already on edge thinking, gee, I want to be really careful because it looks right now like they're under pressure. Maybe I don't want to approach them.
I've heard they fly
off the handle.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
And then the second two categories there, so empathy and social skills, these are the ones that Goleman said go from being about us to actually going to being about the way that we handle relationships. So in the empathy category there, Goleman says empathy is about awareness of others' feelings, their needs and their concerns. It often shows up in an ability to read people well, a really deep willingness to listen for the purpose of really understanding. And I think when we talked about Covey's habits, he had seek first to understand and then to be understood, which fits perfectly into that category of empathy. Taking an active interest in others and bolstering their abilities is the other thing that really fits into that category of empathy as well. And I'm not sure if it was a Covey. Yes, it was. It was a Covey one who also said people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, which once again I think fits in beautifully with that category of empathy by actively listening and displaying that you are taking a genuine interest in people's interests and concerns. You build the trust and the rapport that people will reciprocate over time. Mm. Mm. And then the final one there, social skills, which appears as kind of a little box there, but there's actually an enormous amount of behavioural skill that actually comes into this particular category. So Goleman said all of the following fit underneath that. He said it's social skills are our adeptness at inducing desirable responses in others, which means our ability to communicate effectively, our ability to influence others for good in a constructive way, our ability to manage conflict effectively, to inspire and lead others, to build and maintain relationships and networks, to collaborate and to work towards collective goals. Wow.
Yeah. It's easy to put in a few words.
It's an absolutely massive body of work there, but you can really see why those two are not so much about what we do internally, but about how we actually go about handling, building and maintaining relationships. And I'm not sure whether we will drop this into the comments below this webinar or whether we'll send it out as a separate document. But the second thing that Goleman put together in relation to this is a series of questions. Really, it's a a self-audit, self-assessment questionnaire, which gives us an opportunity to score ourselves. And I've done this with many, many groups. And the value in doing it is what it helps us understand is what are our strengths already, because all of us will have some natural areas of emotional intelligence that we already naturally do pretty well. So they're the things that we can continue to build upon and leverage off to continue to stay effective in those areas, and then pick maybe one or two that we think would really improve our effectiveness if we could chip away at those over time. The problem with a lot of development processes is it's easy to ignore our strengths and try and spend all of our time trying to overcome our weaknesses, and we actually lose sight of what's already working for us. So I'm really encouraging people to lock in those ones that you're already doing really well in, and then just pick one or two. So if you can just advance to the next page on here, it's actually got a copy of the self-assessment. There it is. And what I encourage people to do with this is just go through each of the statements. So there's a number of statements under each of those 5 competencies, and give yourself a score out of 10 for how well you think you currently have embedded that particular competency in your existing approach. And anything, I think if you've got pretty good self-awareness, anything that you score yourself 7 or above in, they're probably things that you're doing pretty well in. And if you wanted to validate that with some people who know you pretty well, whose opinion you value and trust, when you've done it, be prepared to either ask them to do it or share what you've done with them and say, this is how I see me.
Yeah.
How does that line up with how you see me?
Yeah.
And it's really nice sometimes with those areas that you've given yourself some pretty solid scores in, where other people look and say, absolutely. In fact, maybe you haven't even been generous enough with yourself. You've given yourself a 7 there, but I'd give you a 9 because I think you're actually really strong in that area. So if you're willing to open yourself up to, I guess, make yourself a bit vulnerable and get some feedback, it can be really interesting to compare their perception of you with your perception of you, for the point of view of saying, I guess it's a good test of self-awareness in the beginning, how similar or different is the way you see me to the way that I see, the way that I see me. And then to pick, 1 or 2 that you'd like to chip away at.
I'm getting drawn into the questions.
Yeah, to the questions.
Yeah. Recognizing one's emotions and their effects. That could be quite a challenging thing to look at, just in and of itself.
And with ones like that, I think if it's not obvious to you how you would score that, or what you would be measuring yourself against, it could be something that's worth having a conversation with someone about, to say, how do you see me?
Yeah.
Around that.
I guess that's what those 360-degree assessments do a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you get different perspectives. So speaking to someone you really trust, and maybe someone who's just a good friend or that kind of thing. So you see what other people...
Yeah, a peer, a friend, a colleague, someone who's probably seen you in a range of contexts as well.
Yeah.
At your best, at your worst. Who will give you feedback coming from a point of helping you to improve, grow and develop, which really is the place that all feedback should come from. And I think if you ask them in a really open, curious way, because you're wanting to do it to grow your own emotional intelligence, I think what comes back to you is probably going to be pretty useful and probably reasonably balanced as well.
Great. So I've got one more question for you, because we're not talking to a corporation, or we're not talking to a leadership group, although each person obviously is a leader in their own family and community in their own way. But how would you find emotional intelligence? Why would spending time developing that be useful to our audience and to their families and to their communities?
Yeah, good question. I think, as I said, the first three really relate to us. So for me, the reason to chip away at the first three are my self-awareness is my responsibility. And if my self-awareness is low, it is going to be impacting the quality of my relationships. 100%, guarantee it. There's a saying which is that the quality of the relationship is a reflection of the quality of the conversation. And so every conversation I'm having with somebody is helping build or erode that relationship. So if I'm not chipping away at improving my self-awareness and self-regulation, at some point it's probably minimizing the effectiveness of the interpersonal relationships that I've got.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of one reason is for my own effectiveness. Secondly is to ensure that I've got really effective and good quality relationships with the people who I decide it's important to have those relationships with. That might just be with my family or family and friends, but I might also extend that out to committees that I'm on, to community groups that I'm a part of, social clubs, community in general.
Yeah.
I think, and the other one then is, and this, some of COVID's work kind of picks up on this as well. The more effective and aware I am on how I am being and the impact it's having, the more effective I can be in supporting others. So the other reason for chipping away at this stuff for myself is I probably can't do anywhere near as much to support and help others if I haven't actually done the work myself.
Yeah.
If I've actually done a lot of work and I'm in pretty good shape in relation to most of these, it's probably going to help me to support and underpin and grow others to be more effective as well. So if I've got family members or other people in the community who I care about, who I'd love to support, developing these qualities in myself is going to enable me to do that more effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I just thought I'd ask you the question anyway. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about emotional intelligence?
Other than it's a massive field. There's been a lot of work done on it probably in the last 30 years or so. If you typed emotional intelligence into a search engine back in early 2000, you would have found a few papers here and there. If you type it in now, you'll probably find more volumes than you can work your way through. And I think all the research that I'm seeing is that people who are effective are mindful of building their emotional intelligence, because the way we work with others is key. Whether you're in a leadership position or just wanting to be effective in relation to community groups or social connection, building those skills is really critical.
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to ask me any questions about my views about mindfulness?
Yes, I think connecting with the work on emotional intelligence to what that means and how people can perhaps develop some of that through mindfulness would be great. So, so I guess first one being, what do you see as the connection between emotional intelligence and mindfulness? Is there a connection, and what is it?
Well, of course, I'm going to say absolutely. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned the amount of research being done on emotional intelligence over the last, I don't know, would you say 30 years? Because that correlates very broadly with the increase in research on the area of mindfulness as well. And I find it quite interesting that both of those areas have kind of burgeoned in research, given the way our world is. The way the pace of our world has increased so much over our sort of last 30 years with technology, with being able to do this, being able to communicate with people like this. So there's a reason for that. And the reason is that there are some keys, I think, in our sense of emotional awareness and our sense of being present. Because if there's any time on our planet where we're being encouraged to not be present, it's right now. So essentially, with mindfulness, it is, as you said, emotional intelligence. It's a competency as well. So that's the good news. It's another one of those that I feel is in the important, but maybe not urgent category of time management. However, I think sometimes these things develop an urgency in their own way when we face intense situations in our lives and realize we don't necessarily have what it takes to cope with them, or we lose our, flip our lid or lose our stuff. So in terms of mindfulness, mindfulness is essentially an intentional training. So we are deliberately doing something very specific with our attention. And if you think about it, if you just sit and think about it for a moment, so much of our time, there's something going on that we're completely not aware of, which is this little thrum of thoughts that's running just under the surface as we're going about our day-to-day life. And these thoughts have a way of escalating and building on each other, even without our awareness. And quite often these thoughts connect into emotions as well. You may have a thought that I didn't do something on time, and therefore, I'm a bad person, and therefore I shouldn't be able to, have this reward, or I'm never going to get somewhere. So these thoughts can escalate, and they can certainly build up this experience of uncomfortable emotion. And without our awareness, it can happen in an instant, just in an instant. And the whole field of emotions itself has been greatly researched over the last 20 years as well. And emotions are quite mysterious in lots of ways. We have ways of identifying them. We say anger and happiness and joy, but how do they arise? And it's often such a combination of things going on. We have, a thought that comes, we have a body sensation, we feel an impulse to do something, another thought comes, and this feeling arises, and suddenly we have this sense of having an emotion of some sort or another. And then often that will trigger the next sequence, which is trying to figure out why I have this emotion and how I can fix it and how I can get rid of it. And these things just push us along through our lives without really taking the time to notice what's going on, to sort of slowing down. Darren talked about buying time to press the pause button. And I'd have to say that this is one of the primary ways of developing attention, is to actually pause long enough to really notice what it is that's occurring. So in terms of these 5 aspects of emotional intelligence that Daniel Goleman speaks about, they all fit hand in glove with the practices of mindfulness. Self-awareness, really, it's quite vital that we're able to view ourselves to some degree objectively and have this sort of stable and clear way of seeing what's arising. And that requires pushing the pause button. It requires just stopping for a few moments to notice. And really, we often talk about in mindfulness using a non-judging sort of noticing approach. So because we tend to be full of judgments about ourselves. We tend to be full of judgments about all experience without ever questioning where those judgments kind of come from. In terms of self-regulation, well, what we're really doing is developing the ability to be present with all the stuff that comes up. So say that thought comes that I'm not good enough, or that I've stuffed that up, and that leads to the next thought and the next thought and the next thought. To be able to be present enough to really notice that sort of chain of thoughts, the emotions that come, the sensations in the body that arise. This is really the way that we start to create this pause that then gives us, just that little microsecond of pause can give us the opportunity to, maybe rather than having the knee-jerk reaction to the comment someone makes, having an opportunity to recognize that I can actually just say, I need a moment, or I can choose a different response. So giving ourselves that time allows a little bit more opportunity for that self-regulation. And it is a skill that grows. Again, it's a competency that grows. But it definitely happens. This is part of the research that's been happening over the last 20 or 30 years, which has a lot to do with the structure of our brain. I spoke about that a little bit when we had our seminars. That we really do start to embed some new pathways of response as we take this time for a bit of those mindful pauses. I liked what Darren was talking about with motivation, and in the webinar on values, I did a lot of research on sort of how values are identified, and they have very, very much to do with what it is that motivates us. And I would say what motivates us from the highest intent, from our deepest wishes. So coming into touch with that is, again, something that this space of a pause allows for. And empathy and social skills, well, I think one of the things that taking these mindful opportunities to be quiet, to pay attention, when you start to recognize the stuff that's coming up in you, when I start to recognize the stuff that's coming up in me, I see that I am so similar to virtually everyone around me, that just like me, everyone around me deals with these similar sort of patterns of thinking, of self-criticism maybe, of judgment, of trying to keep up in an ever-escalating world. We're all in the same boat, I think, is what I've recognized through developing this competency in myself, which has really increased my sense of empathy for the struggles that others may be going through, and I think in lots of ways has developed a deeper sense of kindness in myself. Of course, that spills over into relationships. I'm a lot more tolerant of you now, aren't I? I'm just saying that in a joking way, but it's actually true as well. I'd have to say that spending that time understanding myself really helps me have a more open space for the people that I love and the people that are my friends, but also beyond that, people who I interact with maybe casually out in the world, even people that I don't like very much. I can still find a way to be able to have some space for them, not just write them off. So yeah, that's kind of quite a long-winded answer to your question.
So what are some ways that mindfulness can be used to train emotional intelligence?
Well, I mean, it is all about that pause, isn't it? It's about really actually stepping into the space. I mean, as I said, mindfulness meditation is attentional training. So there's a few ways that we work with this training. The first one is what I call formal meditation, and that's where you deliberately take some time to, to set aside a quiet space for yourself. So this is, gives us a chance to start to notice what's arising, starts to give us a chance to notice the judgments that come up around our thoughts, etc. And it grows the awareness of what it feels like to be here and now. So through various means, connecting into sensations in our body. So we get a chance to really be present with what's happening right now in a very formal way, as in we've carved out that time deliberately for ourselves. The other way is more what I would call mindfulness in daily life, a more informal approach. And that's where you might just really take specific moments out of the day to really deliberately tune into your senses, into what's happening around you, into the thoughts that are coming through your mind, maybe how you're feeling emotionally. So there's this sort of reflex action happening of landing back in my experience right now. And this is part of that sort of muscle building that happens in the brain, in the way our neural pathways are working, and builds this competency just on the fly. And I've also just noted down here that both of these ways of approaching mindfulness really call on some very fundamental and caring attitudes, and they can really enhance emotional intelligence as well as our general experience. And some of the things I've written down that we work with is patience, because it takes patience to do this. It takes patience to actually sit down and just give yourself 5 minutes of deliberate quiet time. Curiosity, to open up to that childlike ability to be curious about what's coming up, no matter how crazy or mundane it might be. Acceptance, that's the opposite of judgment, isn't it? To really accept what's coming up as just what's coming up, not as a condemnation of us, but that's just what's coming up. Non-striving, to really just recognize that this moment is the moment I'm in, and I don't need to try and get anything done or get anywhere. I can really be in it and just be curious, patient, open to it. Trust, and this is a beautiful quality to encourage in meditation, which is just trusting that as I'm doing this, something is changing in me. Something is opening in me. And more, you can rely on the research that's showing such positive results around these practices. And a very big one, which is kindness, because I don't know if it's the same for men, but I certainly know for women that internal kindness is in short supply. We tend to be very hard on ourselves as women, and critical on all sorts of levels of ourselves. So kindness and caring for ourselves. And out of this, we really start to see things in a fresh way and appreciate, a broader aspect of being here and now in our lives. That's it for that.
And other sort of tips or tricks or practices that people can, use at home that can assist them to practice in these areas that will support their growth and development around emotional intelligence?
Well, first of all, I'd say that, think of that important but not urgent quadrant. Because it's all too easy to say, okay, well, all I'll do is, I'll be more present. I'm gonna really make an effort to be more present in my life. And you can have that thought, go along, and then find that you're snapping at your husband because he didn't pick up his socks, or you're, getting angry with your child because they're 5 minutes late to the bus or whatever. And not that snapping or getting angry are wrong and bad things to do, but it's about developing a specific kind of awareness, this self-awareness and self-regulation. And they don't happen just by thinking, oh, I'm just going to be that way. They happen because we actually put in a little bit of work towards that. So my recommendation is to start small, and I'd say start with 5 minutes a day. Just pick, it's a great thing to pick the same time of day. And I often think first thing in the morning is great because that's before the day gets rolling and other priorities come in. Sit for 5 minutes, find a quiet spot, shut the door, don't have your phone with you, and just quietly pay attention to your breath coming in and out of your body. Just that. Thoughts will come up. You'll notice thoughts come up. You can notice what they are. Practice that attitude of kindness, acceptance, curiosity, patience, those attitudes. Just as thoughts come, letting them go, coming back to your breath. That's really the essence of the meditation. It's not a difficult thing to do. The difficulty comes in actually making that commitment to that little 5-minute window each day. That's the formal kind of side of things. And it's what undergirds then. Another tip is just picking maybe morning tea or waiting for the school bus to come. Picking a time or a couple of times in the day where you deliberately turn that into a short little mindfulness practice. So an example I think of is making your morning cuppa, like really making a deliberate choice that you're going to be 100% present to filling the kettle with the water, the sound of the water going in, the sound of the kettle working, picking out the cup that you want to use, the scent of the tea as it starts to steep, really savoring and noticing the whole act of bringing the cup to your mouth, that first taste of tea. It sounds simple. It sounds kind of ridiculously simple, actually. But those little moments are very deliberate statements to your, to your brain, to your neural pathways, to your whole being, that I really want to practice being present with the fullness of this experience. Because these are the little experiences that we just miss, that we just rush through and then find ourselves at the end of the day exhausted and thinking, what in the hell did I do today? So that's, a little, you could pick 2 or 3 like that in a day. And then I'd also say, consider joining in on a formal learning course where you will be guided by an instructor. And that can really help you sort of step out your understanding and development in this area. There are lots of online courses these days. I would just recommend trying to find one that is a live course where you're interacting with an instructor and other participants rather than a sort of app or a pre-canned course. But, anything to begin with. Just stepping into that important but not urgent quadrant, with a deliberate amount of time that you can manage, not making it a chore or a duty or something to feel guilty about, but for your own good, for the good of you, for your family, for your community. It's worth it, I guarantee you. So I think that's just about an hour, Darren. Can you believe it?
I have no idea. I wasn't timing it.
Well, I'm a great one for keeping time. I always am looking at my watch, and I'm pretty sure we've used up about an hour of these with people's time. So I guess the next step is we'll provide some links and some resources around emotional intelligence, and you know, how you can develop that with various tools, including mindfulness.
And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Cherise or myself if you'd like to ask anything kind of more specific or find out some more resources. We've got piles of books and other resources here that we're aware of that we may not necessarily put into the link. So
yeah,
feel free to ask. So
great to connect with you
I
all.
hope that's been useful for you.
Yeah.
It's been a very different format for us.
Yes.
We'd much rather have been doing this sitting in front of you, but there we go. So thanks for your attention, and hope that's been useful, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah.
Bye all.
Bye all.